2, 1.
Hi, my name is Brett Schoner, and I'm a sophomore here at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and I'm majoring in animal science. And I chose to do my research. The article that I chose to do my research on was the effects of feeder shape on Japanese quail. And the reason why I chose to do this is because I actually recently just purchased a flock of quail and have started raising them on our farm. Now that I have quail, I also have chickens, ducks, and turkeys on our farm as far as the poultry side. And since quail is the newest addition, I thought it'd be beneficial to me to do some learning in class about quail, and potentially especially something such as feeder shape, something that could help benefit my operation, something I could use physically and hands-on. So, the effects of feeder shape on Japanese quail. Summary. This research focused on the effects that different feeder shapes have on Japanese quail. The 4 different types of feeders that were used in this research include the longitudinal feeders, the vertical narrow feeders, the vertical wide feeders, and the round feeders. And one thing that was kind of confusing to me at first when I first started reading the article, and I didn't just skim over it, I just started reading from the beginning, was I had a different definition of what I personally thought a round feeder was compared to what the study described as a round feeder and what the study described as a vertical narrow feeder and a vertical wide feeder. So for me personally, when I thought of a round feeder, I thought of a hanging feeder that has a round base and has a vertical upright column that the feed is stored in, and the feed trickles down to the bottom like a self-feeder. And that's what I personally thought of as a round feeder. But then, as I started looking through the article and the pictures, I learned that a round feeder was actually a round piece of plastic with no upright column that the feed was just placed on. So almost like the feed was on the ground and the birds could scratch at it more naturally. Whereas what I was originally thinking was a round feeder was actually what they described as a vertical narrow feeder and a vertical wide feeder. The narrow and the wide just describes how much area was present between the upright vertical column that stored the feed and the feed pan down below. So I guess that was the hardest thing for me, is just understanding the different language that was used in the feeders and conveying that. And then therefore the longitudinal feeder was what most people think of as like a baby chick feeder, rectangular long feeder with a guard over the top to prevent the birds from going into the feed. So the first graph here, so if you guys see that, you can zoom up there, Quail. So for this first graph, this basically gives a description of the 4 different types of feeders and the observations that were made about the quail. So eating, so the longitudinal feeder, you can see 356.58, vertical narrow 343.5, vertical wide 369.67, and round feeder 372.17. So just to kind of highlight the keys of this graph and what the most important things are in it. So the feeder that the quail were eating the most out of was the round feeder. The feeder that the quail were drinking the most of was the vertical narrow feeder. And then if we start looking at the bird behavior, so I like to look down here at preening. So for those of you who do not know, preening is a natural activity that occurs in quail. It's indicated that the birds are happy and healthy. So we see the most preening with a round feeder. We also see the most dust bathing with a vertical wide feeder, and uniquely enough, the least with a round feeder. And okay, so if we look here at walking, the birds are the most active walking with a round feeder. So basically, to make a long story short here, the conclusion of the research was that the best feeder to use in a quail operation for bird health and the more of a natural feel for the quail, so as far as like from an animal husbandry aspect, was the round feeder. And if you look even further down here though, at flying, so the birds, the flew the most with a vertical wide feeder as compared to a round feeder. But that's where you can look at flying, as most of the time the birds won't necessarily fly unless they are distressed. So if you think of like people out hunting quail or hunting pheasants, a lot of times the birds aren't going to fly unless they are distressed and they're spooked or they're flushed from like a dog or a person or a predator. So that's another instinct right there. But if we look at like feather pecking, it was all pretty even there. But we did see the most feather pecking with the longitudinal feeders. And if you think about that, the birds wouldn't be separated on the feeder. They'd be all on the feeder. They wouldn't have a round area to be spread out more around the feeder there. So those are just some observations from that study there. And we also see that sound. So the birds are more making a larger amount of sound with a longitudinal feeder as compared to a round feeder. Which that necessarily, again, is not always a good thing. The birds may be distressed. So the other graphs that were used in the study, so after looking at the effects and the observations of the quail, as in the previous graph, in these other two graphs, they measured the performance of quail both in a meat aspect and like a growth aspect. In this top graph, table 4, and in the bottom one, table 5, they looked at egg quality and different observations with that. And again, as you can see, we have the 4 different feeders in both of these, and then the different factors. So if we look at from a growth aspect, just a pure focusing on growth, on weight gain, we have the longitudinal feeder at 185.40. And the round feeder is actually the least with a 171.8. We look at this feed conversion ratio, though. The round feeder has a 2.62, followed by the least to a longitudinal feeder with 2.38. But then we can look at this initial body weights. We can see that the quail were initially larger with the round feeder, and then we can look at the body weights at week 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can look at those values. So, as coming from a producer looking at this set of data here, you kind of get some mixed different feelings about it. Because you can see the weight gain. Well, if you're looking at weight gain, obviously you want your quail to be gaining weight, so you're like, oh, longitudinal feeder. But if you look at the feed conversion ratio, you want the round feeder. So, you can look at the data a different way, but you can also look, that's where I think it'd be unique if you did the study again to use maybe a larger amount of quail and do with different amounts and different sizes and maybe even different breeds of quail other than just Japanese quail, because we can see, it'd be interesting to see if those results hold true, and maybe even sort of quail different body weights and sizes as far as that goes. But for me personally, looking at this, and what I would think is, as a producer, I would be wanting to have longitudinal feeders if you're just focusing on raising quail from a meat aspect and a growth aspect there. So as we go down here to table 5, we look at the egg quality traits. Again, the 4 feeders. So egg weight, so 11.48, 10.59, 11.61, 10.36. So we see the biggest egg weights with a vertical wide feeder. Egg width and length, we can see the vertical wide feeder is the biggest width. Length, it's the longitudinal feeder followed by the vertical wide feeder. And then if we look down here at the yolk weight and the albumin weight, which those of you who do not know, the albumin that's in the egg, and that's another good indication of a quality of egg. The albumin is something that keeps the yolk and the outside of the shell connected there. But so we look at the albumin weight and longitudinal and vertical and yolk weight and longitudinal and then the vertical. So then from an egg aspect, it looks like the longitudinal and the vertical wide feeder would be the feeders of choice if you were raising quail just from an egg aspect. But again, it's interesting to see, because why would the longitudinal feeder be better than a vertical narrow feeder, but the vertical wide feeder is the second best choice? It's just, I think that's kind of odd there if you're looking at that, but I think it's very interesting to compare all these graphs when you're looking at the activities of the bird in the first graph, the growth factors in the second graph, and then the egg characteristics in the third graph. And I think it's interesting to see and compare, because technically, if you're looking at what your specific side of the industry is, maybe the different feeders are a better value to your operation. That's something that I personally see from this study. But in conclusion, though, with what the people that did this research over in Egypt concluded is that the round feeder was better simply from an animal husbandry side. That's what they thought was the best option for raising the quail, these Japanese quail. So if I was going to further do research in this area, my hypothesis is that the more feeders that are present, the less aggressive behavior will result. And I feel like I would want to replicate this experiment, but in using the same 4 types of feeders, but using 3 different pens of quail with each feeder. So, for example, in the first pen, use a round feeder, but have 1 round feeder. The second pen, have a round feeder, but have 2, and the other one have 3. So I would use 15 quail per pen in this research, and then take the 4 feeders times 3 is 12, and then multiply that by 15. You get 180 quail. It would be the total amount of quail needed for this experiment. To replicate the experiment as far as using the 4 different types of feeders, but with different amounts of feeders in increments of 1, 2, and 3. And I would measure the results in the same way that they did in this study, with looking at bird activity level, pecking, flying, vocalization, and that would also collect data as far as the growth aspect at weeks 1, 2, 3, and 4, take the initial weights, look at the growth and the feed conversion ratios, as well as the egg side of things, where I'm looking at the egg qualities and all that there as well. So, and then in conclusion, I feel like it would be of great beneficial knowledge, both not just as me, but to the industry in general with quail, to continue doing research like this so that advancements can be made in quail raising and quail farming. And I think that the main reason why I want to get into quail, and I think it provides a very unique kind of a niche market, is you can raise quail for meat quality and meat production, and then for eggs also, because that's kind of a niche market with quail eggs and pickling quail eggs and stuff like that. And then the other one is raising quail for people to use to train bird dogs. That's the reason why I first wanted to get quail. I've started to get into pheasant hunting this year, and I thought it'd be a nice thing to raise quail for people to be able to train their dogs with. But in concluding that, I feel that the further experiments, such as the research that I propose, would be of great benefit to both me and the quail industry in general. And then these are the sources that I used, the article that I used for my presentation on the research article. And that concludes my presentation.